So we're going to now transition to a panel that's going to explore the applications of AI for science. The panel is going to be moderated by David Cox. David Cox is the vice president at IBM Research responsible for training our large language models. He's also the director of the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab. And prior to joining IBM, he was a professor at Harvard and the co-founder of a number of AI startups. And joining David on the panel will be Shirley Ho, Surya Ganguli, Tess, Smidt, and Alex Rives. Welcome to the stage.
All right, so exciting day so far. Keeping in the spirit of the Hudson Forum, bringing ideas together, bringing different fields together, we thought it would be fun and informative and exciting to talk about not just AI qua AI, but how does AI interact with the process of scientific discovery in general. And I'm really excited to have an all-star panel here coming from different fields of science, different approaches to using science, different subfields of AI, to really start to unpack some of that. So I'm going to actually ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and give a brief introduction to their work, and then we'll start some questions.
Sure. Hi, I'm Shirley Ho. I'm a group leader at the Flat Institute, part of Simon's Foundation. My boss is sitting somewhere there. There was Spergel, yeah, right here. He raised his hands. In Flat Institute, we also do this particular research. We call it AI for Science, in particular about this panel. And I'm the director for Polymathic AI, which builds generalist AI models for science. And science here, we go from fluid dynamics, astrophysics, and possibly exploring other fields as well, like material sciences. So I'll be happy to talk about this with you guys.
Sorry.
Great, and my name is Surya Ganguli. I'm a professor in applied physics at Stanford. I kind of took lots of turns. I did my PhD in string theory, and then I did my postdoc in neuroscience. I actually work in both neuroscience and artificial intelligence, sort of trying to understand in general the theory of neural networks, whether they're biological or artificial.
Hi, I'm Tess, Smidt. I'm an assistant professor at MIT in electrical engineering and computer science. All my degrees are in physics. At MIT, I run a group called the Atomic Architects, and the meaning of our name is twofold. We both build tools for understanding and designing atomic systems, but we also look at how we can use fundamental concepts to either build better models or even investigate the behavior of various types of machine learning models.
I'm Alex Rives. I'm chief scientist at a company called Evolutionary Scale. I'm starting a lab at MIT in January. And I lead a team that develops language models for biology. So these are models that are trained on the text of nature rather than on human-generated text.
Okay, great. So one thing I want to explore a little bit is how is AI for science different from general purpose AI? And sometimes we lose sight of what AI is for, which is weird for a field of people who write down objective functions and then optimize them. But we sometimes don't have a clear objective. Are we trying to create super intelligent robots? Are we trying to solve a particular kind of business problem or other problem? How does that play out in science? What role does AI play in the scientific process? And maybe I'll start with you, Tess.
Okay, sure. So it can mean a myriad of things. So sometimes in science, we do have clear objectives, like we want to, or maybe it's even kind of in the realm of engineering of we want to build better materials or more interesting molecules. So I think in that sense, the role that AI can play is pretty clear, like help us get to better solutions faster. But it can also be a little bit less clear of what role AI is going to play as far as helping us with scientific discovery, because a lot of scientific discovery is when something is defying our expectations. So in some sense, we need, maybe it's a type of anomaly detection in a way, but something's kind of breaking our current picture of the world, or even, supposing that there might be a behavior out there in a physical system that we haven't been able to see or fathom. So it can kind of take a variety of different routes.
Alex, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think, there's kind of two dimensions that I think that are really interesting to talk about. So one, maybe first, is the connections and parallels. And Jan was just talking about, learning a world model, basically, from sensory perception and that kind of data. And you can think about that analogy in in the sciences, of course. We're generating enormous data, and here our brains haven't really developed to understand this information. And so, whereas perhaps we have some guidance from neuroscience in how to think about how to develop a system that might be able to do things that human beings can do, how do we create systems that can, understand the world in ways that we can't? And, nobody can really read the sequence of a protein and tell you what 3D structure it would fold into. So there's enormous potential in solving that. But there are these very deep connections, because the same tools that we can use across AI seem to also work in science. And so, for instance, the models that we train are these transformer models, which are doing token prediction. It's just that the tokens are generated by evolution rather than the senses.
I want to zero in on two words you said. One was tools, and the other one was understand. And maybe I could ask you, Shirley, about what role does AI play as a tool in science? Because you're serving many different fields.
Yeah. I like to be, since we are among friends here, I like to be slightly provocative.
Okay.
So recently, a company has built something called AI Scientist. For those who follow us on Twitter, you probably know. So maybe I'll be out of job tomorrow. It basically will write a hypothesis, or the model writes a hypothesis, run the experiments, write the codes to run the experiments. These cases are computer science experiments. So it's all on the computer. And then it produces the paper plot, writes the paper, and even reviews itself. Like, it will even have a loop to review itself.
But does it write the grant?
Doesn't write the grant yet. That's the next goal, I guess. So there's this level of are we getting replaced as a scientist? But then there's also the other question of, can we work with each other, like a tool or like an AI assistant? Mm-hmm. Maybe you'll write my grant for the next cycle for, I don't know, NSF or DOE. So that's the tool level to all the way to replacing us. So I guess there's a range of as to how people respond to whether we're building a tool or something that replaces the scientist directly.
And maybe, Surya, maybe I want to ask about the question about understand. Yeah. So there's a sense came out in what Alex said and also what Tess said about how maybe there's something about this domain, we just can't grok it because our brains weren't evolved to grok that domain. We use AI as a sort of adapter so we can understand it better. But, and then you're obviously working across all the fields, but neuroscience and AI in particular, there's a sense in which we start getting into interesting questions about what does it even mean to understand something, and does AI change that shape? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, as a scientist, I'm in the game for human conceptual understanding. Like these AI systems are fantastic at predicting. They're fantastic at, like in a field like drug discovery, yeah, you want to design the protein that will bind the ligand. You don't really care. You don't need to necessarily understand how it does it. But in many, many domains of science, you're searching for that conceptual understanding. And we have a lot of work to do there. I am quite excited about, for example, explainable AI. So for example, in one case study, we developed actually the world's best model of the retina that could predict the retinal response to natural movies. But then there were 20 years of experiments done on the retina, which yielded really interesting nonlinear responses. That model generalized to all of those 20 years of experiments in artificial stimuli. We're like, this is fantastic. Now we can understand how the retina does all of these things. So the way we did that is we applied explainable AI techniques to take our big model and extract from it simpler models for any given stimulus, and we can conceptually understand how it does it. Just as one example, world models, right? Your retina already has a world model that knows about Newton's first law of motion, which is that objects that are in motion will tend to remain in motion. If you have a bar that moves and it suddenly reverses, your retina sends a huge complaint to your brain saying, wait a minute, that bar violated Newton's first law, I better warn the brain. We saw that detection of violations of Newton's first law in our deep learning model, and we could analyze it algorithmically and figure out how it did it, and that yields testable predictions for experimentalists to do, plus conceptual insight. I'm really excited about explainable AI in that way for science, for conceptual insight, but there's a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, there's this Borges story about a map maker creating a map of the world and ends up creating a map that's the size of the world and covers the whole world. So there's a sense in which sometimes if we have a model that can accurately predict results, doesn't mean we actually understood. And in the AI, we're all in the business of building things we don't understand how they work all the time. But I'm interested in something you said, Tess, about how even if you're in that case, that might still be, it might not meet the rigor of what you would want to define as understanding for science, but it might be useful and interesting anyway. I mean, Surya, you're sort of saying, well, we can actually now interrogate this model, so we traded an easier to access thing for something that was hard to access. But how does that extend into the world of material science?
Right, yeah. So a lot of the topics that I focus on are atomistic sciences. And one of the struggles here is that atoms are really small and unruly, and you put them someplace and they kind of run around, and they're very hard to keep track of. It's very hard to experimentally observe them. So we often resort to computational models of atomistic systems. But even then, there's huge computational hurdles to accurately modeling systems. It typically invokes simulating quantum mechanical systems, whether you're doing that on a quantum computer or a very large classical computer. It takes a long time. So actually getting the intuition as a scientist for should I be using this subgroup on this molecule to bind to this protein, or should I put the atoms in this configuration to make this really new, amazing, low energy semiconductor or something? That's really hard. So I'm very excited on kind of the simulation front of just being able to kind of get more responsive tools and getting them in the hands of scientists so we can kind of play with things more. There's a lot of user interface design opportunities there as well. But then also on the actually understanding, actually grokking what is happening in the physical system, developing kind of larger principles. We know how to evolve the Schrodinger equation. That's not the problem. The problem is that you can write the equation down and it doesn't really tell you anything about what's going on in a system. So abstracting out to kind of simpler principles, maybe through kind of the types of explainability that Surya was mentioning, I think that's also really helpful. And I'm not sure if I answered all of your question, but that was certainly aspects of it.
That was plenty. Very good, yeah, fantastic. Alex, I wanted to ask about data. And the data types are different in science than where the bulk of the energy in sort of AI as a CS field are pointing. What are some of the unique challenges in biology with applying these techniques?
Well, maybe I can talk a little bit about the types of data that we use for protein models, and then maybe talk a little bit more broadly. So I think proteins are really, really beautiful because, for one thing, we have a tremendous amount of data because of the cost of gene sequencing has just been going down on this faster than Moore's law curve. Scientists have been able to generate just vast kind of surveys of the Earth's protein diversity, where we really can read out the sequences of proteins across all of life. One of the things that I think the learning algorithms that we have are really good at is they're good at finding structure within high-dimensional data. And so, from a very first principle, you need data that has structure. And so that's also what makes proteins very interesting, because they're generated by evolution. And so you can think, evolution generates the next token, and each token is, selected in a sense by evolution. And so the underlying biological principles are visible in theory, sort of in the structure of that data. And that's been the argument that's been used to motivate language modeling as well, the idea that the structure of the world is present in the patterns in language. So I think that a lot of the methods that kind of work in this space that are using self-supervised or unsupervised learning are methods where there is some kind of deep distributional hypothesis for the data, where there is an idea of what that structure is and how it's determined. And so that's one of the core things that we look for. And in biology, it's very interesting because, of course, we can generate data also such that it would have that structure if we think about it. And I think one of the frontiers in my area is really measurements of the cell. So we can measure proteins, but what if we had data looking at cellular states, at the same level of scale. And then, the distributional hypothesis would be kind of the underlying circuitry of the cell. And so you might be able to learn the biology of health and disease and the circuits of the cell from that.
Great. And on the other end of the spectrum, and you span a pretty big spectrum, can you speak to data in other fields of science, and in particular, this notion? I mean, some of my physicist friends tell me about, like, where they're measuring out to the 15th decimal place of this constant, and like, okay, that sounds amazing, but it's not the world I live in. Like, how does the world of physics, where there's precision, there's these massive changes in length, diversity in length scales, mesh with the world of AI, which is often messy and sort of good at interpolation and maybe less good at extrapolation?
There's so many answers to this. I don't know where to start yet. Let me start with how does this multi-scale physics world that you're thinking about, like multi-link scales, to, I guess, the AI world in particular. I will go back to like what you just talked about in terms of, like, say, large language model. When you predict the next token, which Alex just talked about, you are looking at not just the sentence or the word before, but also like this paragraph, the chapter, and like the whole book, right? So there is a natural multi-scaleness in it, which our group actually utilized to predict the multi-scale physics in a simulation such as, you can imagine the ones like for oceanography or atmospheric science, right? So right now, if you want to predict climate for the next 50 years, it's actually really hard to do it. Actually, 50 years is easy because it might be just one-time step. But like many, many years from now, it's very difficult. And how do you make, maybe there's just one simulation you can make that could be predicting correctly, so AI can possibly help you to accelerate these simulations with these multi-scale large language model techniques that Alex just talked about. So I guess we go from multi-scaleness to the AI side of the world. And then there's the other part of, I think the data, you have to treat them differently from the text data that says, oh, you're awesome in Hudson Forum because you just, surrounded by cool people. That is a text that's very easy to use large language model to model. While if you're analyzing the entire Earth with the atmosphere, oceanography, the ice sheet moving, how would you represent it in your transformer model that Alex just talked about? That will be an interesting question. That are very different from the text side. Sorry, it's a long answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think a big part of what's emerging kind of here is this idea that there just are different demands. This is a tool, can be used flexibly, and it can drive a lot of different directions. And that perhaps we're not, like, there's a sort of emerging narrative that we're going to build some super intelligent model somewhere that is going to understand everything and be an AI scientist. And I think maybe we could just do a quick poll. Does anyone think that's going to happen?
The superhuman part or the AI scientist?
The GPT-7,
I think it's hard to understand a geometric world without having sort of geometric representations of things. The most natural encoding for physics is the universe, but that's not what's easily computable by our modern machines. So we have to come up with something else, some other sort of data structures. Now, getting scientific data into a form that is easily ingestible by computers, that's pretty hard. And so the best thing you can do is okay, make some plot. Maybe you have a squiggle. What does that squiggle mean? Is it, the signature for two black holes colliding in gravitational waves, or is it a spectra for something? So there's often, we'll have simplistic representations of complex physical systems, and then how do we sort of support that data with some additional context, either by only training that model on that type of data, or, is there some other way to give that context? And then you can go into even like scientific principles like physical laws. So we know a lot about physical laws. We know that, well, as long as you don't go too fast, the world appears to be three-dimensional with some dimension of time. What if we give that to the model as a given, build it into the model? How much more does it have to learn to understand quantum mechanics? So I think there's a lot of ways in which we can leverage our scientific knowledge to kind of build compact, expressible models. Does that mean we can't just like throw everything in the kitchen sink into a transformer and get a useful AI scientist? Crazy things happen. So I'm sure that's going to be one approach, but it's not going to be the only approach towards scientifically useful models, especially for understanding.
Yeah, maybe I'll speak to that with just one example. It's something I saw on Twitter where somebody was explaining something where they had a video of the wave equation and the diffusion equation, and the video was the waves were expanding like this for the wave equation, and a little perturbation spread out like for the diffusion. And the description that the person who was teaching it said the wave equation transports singularities and the diffusion equation smooths out singularities. Okay, what would it take for an AI system to look at these videos and come up with that poetic description, right? It's some kind of deep insight that doesn't exist at the level of next token prediction or anything like that. And I think those deep insights were just not there yet at all in AI for science.
May I try to be controversial? I think it might be possible with the right training set.
Yeah.
Like if you have enough of these Twitter posts,
Okay,
that
yeah.
would have access.
But that's the problem. It can't read the Twitter post and then repeat it, right?
Not to repeat, but just to learn how to
that's
poetically
another
describe.
issue about, one of the things we're working on is like a theory of creativity for, say, diffusion models at the moment. Like when you're creating a new sample, is that sample in some sense a combination of the training examples or not? And for simple data sets, we have an analytic theory that can explain how they're creative. But I suspect that if we really understood the training data, and which we don't have access to for many of these models, we might realize that these systems are not deeply creative as we might think. That they're sort of mixing and matching parts of the training data to create samples. Or, I mean, there's huge issues potentially of data set contamination in benchmarks and so forth.
But that's why I think the physics is good, because then you actually can check what is behind all these data sets.
Yeah.
Like if you can train it with physics or biology or scientific data in general, there are physical principles they can go back to and say, hey, what's behind all this? Are there data contamination across test and train?
Yeah.
Sorry, Alex.
I'll take a more optimistic view on this. And I think it depends on what you're looking for. So, being pragmatic about it, let's say, and I think that you can think of kind of the systems that we're building with self-supervision and as sort of emergent simulators. And they're not simulators in the classical sense. The classical sense would be you know all the first principles and you encode them into a system of equations and you let it evolve over time, and you examine the possible outcomes under randomness. That has been sort of the dream of science for a very long time. It's essentially intractable for very difficult problems, like just simulating how a protein might fold. There's an exponential number of possibilities, let alone an entire cell. But at the same time, we can make predictions, right? And so that's, I think, very interesting to begin to think about if you have a system that can be in a closed loop, which can make predictions, and you have a knowledge base that is coupled with that can use the simulation. You can begin, I think, to explore. And one of the beauties of science is, unlike, and I think, Shirley, you were making this point, right? Like unlike natural language or images where the evaluation is inherently subjective, like we can put things to the empirical test. And so we've found that, these language models can generate proteins that have, structures and sequences which, really aren't in their training data. And we can look at that very rigorously. And they might be made of parts of the training data, so that's an interesting point.
No, I think the application of proteins is a fantastic application because evolution has built in a lot of structure, it obeys the structure of physics, and so forth. So I think that's a fantastic place to look. And your training data is public, so you can rigorously answer these questions.
You can look at it, yeah. But I think there's something interesting epistemically about that, because if a model trained on protein sequences can do that, shouldn't other categories of data have? I mean, if there is some structure that can be put together through patterns. So you can think of it as a grammar rather than a physics.
I think the issue with these huge LLMs and so forth is that they have such a bizarre pattern of capabilities and fragilities, right? And their surface of capabilities and fragilities are both quite large, so that people can cherry pick successes in one domain and be optimistic, and cherry pick failures in another domain and be pessimistic. Let me just give one example of deep logical reasoning in LLMs. They're terrible at it. They don't length generalize very well. Like if they solve puzzles of a certain length, they can't solve puzzles of a larger length. They can't do like multi-step deductive reasoning and so forth. So that's a big failure, and that's where I think we need system 1, system 2 methods. For example, if you look at the systems that, like AlphaGo and the Math Olympiad stuff, they don't just rely on neural networks, right? They also have System 2 type model-based search, right? Monte Carlo tree search in AlphaGo and automatic theorem provers and checkers in the Math Olympiad stuff. So all of that is on the horizon at the moment, and I think we just have to be open-minded about the weaknesses of these things so we don't get stuck in a local optimum.
Yeah. If I could add one more thing, like I think you highlighted something that's really interesting, which is that sometimes you see these paradoxes in generalization where it appears that a model can both do a thing and not do the same thing. So we see this with proteins where there's a class of proteins that are outside the training distribution where the predictions aren't very good and it correlates with how much information you have on the training data. But then you can find a protein that doesn't have any similarity in anything at all in the training data that the model can generate de novo that it well predicts and that will actually fold in the lab. So, kind of how do you, there's a really, I think something really interesting intellectual actually in that paradox and how the models are working.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think there's like one thing, this is backtracking a little bit, but I think it connects kind of a lot of things that Shirley and Surya and Alex have been saying, as well as, okay, so there's the notion of prediction of something, and we can objectively kind of check against reality, and I think that's a big win for AI for science. There's also this notion of you can have the same data and form very different models of the world, and many different models are consistent with certain sets of data, and it's only really until you run across kind of like the boundary conditions of when the model's failing that you really kind of figure out which model is correct or not. The Earth, the sun goes around, the sky, and for a long time we're like, okay, well, the Earth is kind of chilling and the sun's moving, and it took us a while to figure out kind of celestial mechanics and things like that. But and some of that was from having new data, but at some level we were interpreting the data in a very specific way. So I think the notion of paradigm shifts in science are super important, and I think this connects back to like creativity, that it's not even just seeing the same data and drawing like a new conclusion necessarily, but even just kind of stepping and looking at the data from a different perspective. And I think that's a really big part of scientific progress is when you've had these perspective shifts. Maybe it's inspired by a different field, maybe it's just sort of realizing when you were making an assumption that you didn't realize you were making. But I think that's kind of a core aspect of science that I think it might be particularly difficult to articulate how to do perspective shifts in science with models. Not impossible, but I think that part might be quite challenging.
I wanted to pull on one more thread before we turn it over to the audience. So the idea, the question of data and data openness came up, and that's sort of a core principle of much science, though actually a lot of data is kind of jealously guarded by the people who collected it sometimes. But there are questions you can answer when you have access to the data, and then there's things you can't. To the extent that LLMs, actual language models, become part of the scientific infrastructure, how big of a problem is it if we don't know what's inside? We don't know what data was used to train them. We can't ask a question about, am I being limited by aping or pulling together examples that were in the training data because I don't know what the training data was? Is that a problem? Is it something we need to worry about?
So in our group Polymathic, we train actually not large language model, but large scientific data model,
right.
And we'll make all the data public actually. So I think that is one way to also test train and see whether we're just remembering everything when we make predictions, right? So we don't make mistakes. Also, and I think it's important to be open source in this case, in particular for scientific understanding. I think that you need to go back to data for sure. So it has to be open source.
Yeah, I think for scientific evaluation of these models, it's essential that we have access to training data because we need to know what they were taught, and then to use that to assess its generalization capabilities and so forth. I think from an application perspective, you don't necessarily need to know the training data, right? Lots of companies are trying to make money off of ChatGPT without knowing the training data.
Yeah.
You can use Alex's models without knowing the training data. So yeah.
Yeah, I think from another perspective, you could also consider the data that you use to validate the model, if that's sort of kept secret in a way, so that folks can't try to game the system. I mean, this is sort of like what's done for CASP, for protein folding. It's like you keep certain crystallography or cryo-EM structures secret until it's kind of released for evaluating the models. And that's another approach, but then you have to have trustworthy sources of validation. And I think that model is probably distasteful for a scientific audience, but I could see that being maybe a necessary thing in other domains.
But here's scathing evidence that some of these benchmarks were in the training data. I saw a really nice talk by one of my colleagues at Stanford, Tatsu Hashimoto, where he said, okay, let's say you have a sequence of questions. Evaluate the log probability of that sequence of questions under the model, then randomize the order of the questions, evaluate the log probability. If it's much higher in the former case, chances are it's memorized that particular sequence of questions. Yeah. And for many data sets it had, right? Nice. So that's pretty scathing. And it might just be like the people, it wasn't malicious, the people training it forgot to take out like some benchmarks from the training set, right? Or maybe there's duplicate benchmarks all over the web and they just didn't remove all of them,
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's an interesting question, that even the model developers often don't know what data was in the model.
Exactly, yeah.
Because nobody could possibly look at it all. Other cases like GSM 8K, 1K, they created a new version of a benchmark, and lo and behold, some models conspicuously did worse on the recreated, held out benchmark. So that's an interesting thing that we deal with in computer science, but in science at least, the hope would be that it's constitutionally, the spirit of the thing should be openness. Alex, any thoughts on open?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I mean, I think, our models have benefited enormously from kind of the effort that went in the scientific community into creating large-scale gene sequencing data sets. And I think that, these generating data at that scale is a massive societal level effort, and many things can be built on top of that. So I think there's immense value. I also lead a company that's commercializing some of these models, and so of course when we work with customers, a lot of what we need to provide is security around their data and assurance that we won't incorporate their data into models, but they will know what their data is. But I think certainly with science, there is, and with data, there's a level of empirical rigor that you can bring to understanding, what the model has been trained with, and as I said before, creating data sets that could, have exactly the right structures so that you would be able to learn from them efficiently.
Can I just add a quick point? I think there's the other side of the story where when you release the data, you actually will create a wave of people trying to build better models, just like what ImageNet had done for, convolution neural net and all the other architectures. Mm-hmm. So, like in Polymathic, we're planning to release all these data sets out in hopes that people build better model on top of it to compete with us. Yeah.